Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into a really complex figure, Kim Jong-il, the former leader of North Korea.
Mm.
And what our sources really highlight is this stark, almost unbelievable contrast, extreme personal wealth and, well, luxury, right alongside brutal, widespread oppression.
Yeah, it's a jarring picture, like a kind of modern potentate living this incredibly lavish life, while the nation itself is facing just profound hardship and human rights issues.
Exactly. So our mission, if you like, in this deep dive is to try and understand the key parts of his rule. We really want to focus on that juxtaposition, the luxury versus the brutality, and look at, well, how he maintained power through it all.
It's a disturbing paradox, absolutely. And I think looking at the source material, seeing the details of that lavishness next to the accounts of famine and repression, it forces you to ask how they're connected, doesn't it? To really grasp the regime.
Definitely. So let's start near the beginning. His early life, even his birth story seems, well, deliberately mythical, right?
Right. There are conflicting dates. For starters, it was in 1941, or the official story, 1942.
And this whole narrative built around his birth, it seems designed mostly to, glorify the family line, especially his father, Kim Il-sung.
Precisely. That carefully crafted origin story was absolutely essential. It wasn't just history. It was about building legitimacy for the Kim dynasty, giving his birth these extraordinary, almost divine circumstances.
Sort of laying the groundwork for the cult of personality later.
Exactly. It was a cornerstone. So when his father died in 94 and he took over, he was 53, then he inherited this powerful prepackaged image.
But it wasn't maybe quite as simple as just stepping in. The sources hint at a period of political maneuvering behind the scenes.
Oh, definitely. It seems it took time to really cement his authority. There are accounts of purges, of manipulating factions, building alliances. It wasn't just automatic.
Like a power struggle simmering beneath that surface of, absolute control.
I think that's a good way to put it. You have the inherited power from his father, sure, but he still had to actively assert his own dominance within the existing structures,
Yeah.
the party, the military.
Right.
These purges, the manipulations, they weren't just about him. They were probably seen as necessary to ensure the Kim dynasty itself survived long term.
Okay, so once he did consolidate that power, the gap between his lifestyle and ordinary North Koreans just becomes, wow, let's get into the extravagance.
Hmm.
Our sources talk about this obsession with luxury goods, like over 100 Mercedes-Benz cars, including an armored one smuggled through China.
Yeah, and you have to picture this fleet, these motorcades, against the backdrop of often really poor infrastructure in the country.
What does that signal, that kind of very visible consumption?
Well, it's not just about personal comfort, is it? It's a deliberate projection of power, of being untouchable. And his taste for expensive imports, French wines, caviar, even things like sushi,
Is she?
apparently,
Mm.
all imported, while the general population was facing severe food shortages, especially later.
Yeah.
It just screams skewed priorities and the absolute privilege of the leadership.
And then there's his private entertainment world. This gets frankly bizarre and quite disturbing.
Hmm.
He supposedly saw himself as a film expert, right? Collecting over 20,000 foreign movies, American, Japanese, European films.
A huge personal library, yes,
Yeah.
but it goes beyond just collecting.
Right, the kidnapping incident. A South Korean director and an actress taken in the 70s, allegedly to make propaganda films for him. It's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. It shows, I think, the regime's desire for total control over culture, over narratives. Film wasn't just a hobby. It was seen as a strategic tool.
And the kidnapping itself just shows a complete disregard for, well, everything. International law, basic human rights.
Absolutely. And then there's the mention of the pleasure squad. These young women, entertainers, reportedly selected to cater to his desires. It just adds another layer of exploitation and dehumanization that comes with that kind of absolute power.
It's grim. And speaking of symbols of power, the private train, that's almost legendary.
It is iconic, isn't it?
Not just transport, but a heavily guarded mobile palace. Lavish inside, satellite TV, chefs, attendants.
Everything. Traveling through a country where many people lacked basic necessities.
What does that train symbolize moving through that landscape?
It really encapsulates the bubble the leadership lived in. A self-contained world of extreme luxury moving through this landscape of hardship. It's such a stark visual of the two realities existing side by side, the chasm between their lives and everyone else's.
And that extends to where he lived, too. The sources mention these sprawling mansions in Pyongyang.
The multiple residences, yeah. Filled with expensive art, the latest technology, surrounded by private gardens, parks.
Again, think about that compared to the average person's living conditions. Lack of reliable electricity, basic infrastructure.
It reinforces that almost feudal structure, doesn't it? Where the elite live in unimaginable privilege, completely disconnected from the daily struggles of the population. And displaying that wealth openly helps maintain the power dynamic, discouraging challenges.
But all this luxury, this extravagance, it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was happening against this backdrop of immense suffering. The famine in the 1990s is just horrifying.
Devastating. Estimates vary wildly, but we're talking hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of deaths.
Caused by mismanagement, floods, the collapse of Soviet aid.
A confluence of factors, yes. But the key point is the regime's response, or lack thereof.
Right. The sources suggest continued hoarding of resources, still importing luxury goods, while people were literally starving. What does that tell you about their priorities?
It's a damning indictment. While natural disasters definitely played a part, the leadership's decisions, mismanagement, reluctance to accept certain kinds of international aid, prioritizing military spending and their own luxuries directly made the crisis far, far worse.
His continued indulgence during that time? It shows a really chilling indifference, doesn't it?
A profound indifference to the suffering of his own people, yes.
And beyond the famine, there's the systematic political repression, routine purges, forced labor camps.
An iron fist. The sources mention the execution of his own uncle, Chiang Sang-saik, though that was technically under Kim Jong-un, but the pattern was set. Reports of other family members being killed, too. It highlights the ruthlessness used to stamp out any perceived threat.
And the labor camps, the Kwanliso, reports suggest they became even more brutal under his leadership.
Yes, that's indicated. Places where political prisoners, often arrested without any real trial, faced incredibly hard labor, torture, starvation, essentially a death sentence for many.
What was the main point of all this brutality? Just fear.
Fear was a huge part of it, absolutely. Eliminating rivals, yes, but also creating this pervasive atmosphere of terror to control the entire population. The camp system was a core tool for silencing any dissent, ensuring total obedience. The scale and the cruelty are just staggering.
And holding it all together ideologically was this massive cult of personality.
Absolutely central. Elevating Kim Jong-il and his father Kim Il-sung, declared the eternal president after his death, to this almost godlike status.
Constant propaganda, making him seem like a military genius, responsible for everything good.
Despite the reality of economic collapse and oppression for so many. Yeah. And it wasn't optional. People were forced to take part in mass rallies, displays of loyalty. Any sign of disrespect, however small, could lead to severe punishment for you and your whole family.
So it wasn't just about obeying, it was about believing, or at least pretending to believe, constantly.
Exactly. It created a suffocating environment where genuine independent thought was incredibly dangerous, if not impossible. You had to perform devotion, constantly reinforcing the leader's infallibility, no matter what you actually saw or experienced.
Okay, so Kim Jong-il dies in December 2011. His son, Kim Jong-un, takes over. Looking back, what's the legacy? It's incredibly controversial, obviously.
Deeply controversial. He left North Korea in a state of, well, profound repression, economic stagnation, and almost total international isolation.
Despite his personal access to, the best the world could offer.
Right. He had the power, the resources, perhaps, to try and modernize, to improve lives. But the sources suggest that wasn't the priority. Maintaining power, the dynasty, his own lifestyle that seemed paramount.
So, a failure to lift his country up.
By almost any objective measure, yes. And his successor, Kim Jong-un, has continued many of the same policies, the same focus on the military, the nuclear program, maintaining that tight control. The personality cult continues.
So the international scrutiny, the concerns about human rights, the disparity between the leadership and the people, that all carries on.
Very much so. His legacy is really one of entrenched totalitarianism, economic hardship for the many, and this bizarre extreme privilege for the very few at the top. It's a stark warning about unchecked power.
So pulling it all together from our deep dive today, it really boils down to this shocking dichotomy, doesn't it? This almost unbelievable level of personal extravagance right alongside profound, widespread human suffering and brutal oppression.
Precisely. It's a powerful and deeply disturbing illustration of what can happen when absolute power isn't accountable to anyone, when personal indulgence trumps the basic needs and rights of an entire nation.
His role is just a chilling case study, really. The sheer contrast between his life and the lives of ordinary North Koreans is something that stays with you.
It absolutely does. It remains a potent symbol of the human costs of that kind of regime.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. When you look at these extreme disparities of wealth and power, like in Kim Jong-il's North Korea, it makes you ask, how can systems like this even persist in our modern world? What factors allow them to take root and endure? And maybe, what responsibilities, if any, do outside countries or international bodies have when faced with situations like this? It's a really complex question with no easy answers. Something to think about as we wrap up this deep dive.